Global Order. I'm delighted once again to welcome on Global Order Dean Bhaskar Chakraborty of Tufts. He's sitting at the heart of the American academic establishment, which has gone through terrible turmoil in the last few weeks. Some would argue the largest amount of turmoil since the Vietnam War protests broke out. But many would argue that actually these protests cannot be compared. They're very different. To talk about what he's been feeling these many days as he's seen such chaos across academia in America, I invited Dean Chakraborty to share his reflections and thoughts as an academic in America, running a big program and a school, and reflecting on past, present, and future of where this protests take us. He's also written a very interesting article which triggered this conversation, where he argued that academia in America would be fine, but society would be far worse impacted. To talk about all that, Dean Chakraborty, thanks very much for your time.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Hindal. Good to be back on your program.
I want to begin by asking you, in the essay that you wrote, you argued that academia would be fine. Let's take that part first. Why would you argue that academia would be fine? Many people are saying this is actually an epochal or an epoch-making moment for American academia and not in a positive way. But you're arguing that, this too shall pass in a sense.
Yeah, I think, maybe I'm being a bit Pollyannish about this, but, ultimately, when we look at institutions that we have around, around the world and specifically here around the United States, the one place where we still have, a debate, discussion, disagreement is on university campuses, and arguably the level of debate, the depth of debate has been constrained over the years because of a number of different changes in terms of what people will or will not accept, policies and other restrictions. Sometimes there's self-censorship. That said, I do believe that we still have a forum for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and people specifically, come to university campuses to be exposed to ideas and opinions that are different from theirs. So, and I think that fundamental role of the academy is, it does appear vulnerable at times like this, but at the same time, I do believe that the academy will survive. It's an institution that has been around, since for a long time, hundreds and hundreds of years, and of course it evolves, but it evolves very, very slowly. So I think the academic establishments will survive. What I really worry about is what happens outside these serene and perhaps these days not so serene green lawns or outside the wrought iron gates, and many of the other institutions that we turn to as part of a democracy. That's where I see some secular changes that get me a whole lot more worried.
We'll talk about that in just a moment, but I want to stick to academia for the time being to ask you. A lot of people made this argument that, well, there were the Vietnam War protests and, American academia survived, America survived, right? But in many ways, these protests, the counter view is that these protests were not like the Vietnam War protests. I mean, there, of course, there was an American government, there were American soldiers on the ground, American military and forces on the ground. It was an entirely different thing. Also, in terms of knowledge of the protesters, a lot of people, and there are a lot of these videos floating around, which show that many of the protesters this time perhaps did not entirely know the situation in the Israel-Palestine conflict in its entirety. They knew bits and pieces of it. They knew one side of it, maybe. They made up their mind in a particular way. And but the entire complexity of the situation really escaped them. I mean, we had really farcical moments when somebody defended North Korea in a protest, arguing that North Korea has never recognized Israel. Now, this may be a facetious example, but a lot of people have pointed out that the knowledge base, especially among students, of the complexity of the Israel-Palestine issue today in these protests cannot be compared with the depth of what happened in the Vietnam War protests. Do you buy that argument?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the argument, because we're talking about, some fundamentally different things. There's, as the old saying goes, history repeats itself, but at the same time, history doesn't quite repeat itself. And maybe it does come back in a different form. Maybe it rhymes, and it's not exactly in the way it appeared, several decades back. And of course, these protests and this situation and this current moment in time and the way in which we get information, we process information, we communicate information is very different from the way it was in the 60s. So, of course, these issues are different. Of course, the issues are very, very different in the sense that back in the 60s, and particularly if you think about the Vietnam War, students were being, young people were being drafted into the military. And so the students actually had a vested interest in the war not continuing, because they were being, pulled into a war that, to a large degree, they didn't fully understand. They didn't quite know what was going on, other than the fact that they didn't want to be, sent to the front lines. So here we have a very different situation. The students are protesting things that are, for some of them, it is very real. Some of them, it does matter directly, because it's their community, it's their families, it's their friends affected. But for most of the students, they are not directly affected by what they're protesting. So I do believe that, first of all, we have to separate the fact that history is repeating itself in certain ways, but obviously the details of history are very, very different relative to what happened before. Second, in terms of the kind of information that people have regarding the issues that they are protesting, that's fragmented, and it's limited and it's superficial, which is entirely true of young people today. And that's no different from young people back in the 60s. They too had access to extremely fragmented and limited information. So I don't necessarily think there's anything new about that, other than the fact that people get their news over digital platforms, which themselves have a way to amplify certain kinds of information and suppress others. And you do get to only skim the something that is, very, very deep and complex and subtle and has a long historical, backdrop, which the digital platforms don't necessarily reveal. But back in the people would turn to paper platforms, and they were, confronted by similar issues. So I do think that these are separate issues, which is the current moment similar to what happened in history, and how much depth of information and knowledge and insight do people really have about the issues that they're protesting. And I agree with you that, people are working with relatively limited information, and largely the information that they are getting, is based on, they may not even have read, the details behind it, but the images themselves are something that is bringing them out. And then there's a crowd effect, which is if my friends and my colleagues are out there, I want to join them in solidarity. So there is that element as well. So I think the historical analogy that I would point to is less in terms of what's happening on campus, but really what's happening off campus. And the off campus part of this is the political backdrop in the United States. And to some extent, there is a repetition of the political backdrop that we had in the 60s.
Let's come to the second part of your argument, which is that American society would probably be worse impacted than American academia has been. Take us through, in what way do you feel that these protests would impact American society at large, especially, of course, with the shadow of a big, tumultuous, should I say, election, around the corner?
Yeah, I think the American society, for one, I hesitate to speak for American society as a whole, because it's like any society, it is not a monolith, and depending on where you sit, the society looks very different. People are divided and confused over so many matters, and the issues in the Middle East, which are, kind of the central issue on the campus protests today, that's not the only issue over which, people are divided and they have concerns. And all of that sort of feeds into the larger backdrop of the general elections, the presidential elections that are happening here in 2024. I think the events of the Middle East certainly go very deep within certain communities, certainly the Jewish communities and the Arab and Middle Eastern communities, and others who are who feel very strongly on either side. To go very deep, but the larger part of American society, is not terribly directly affected by it, other than the fact that they news or they hear about it, and it worries them. But for most people, it is the issues that worry them are bread and butter matters. Am I better off than my parents' generation? Issues like that, and that's no different from societies anywhere. So many of these questions are hitting the front pages and the headlines, but the American electorate is actually not that different from voters anywhere else, where it's the pocketbook and their day-to-day lives that are a lot more significant in terms of how they relate to political candidates they're offering.
I'd like you to wear your academic hat for a moment, Dean Chakraborty, and talk to us a little bit about American academia in general. Even before these protests, there were another set of protests, especially in certain campuses, when, in the first presidency of Donald Trump. Those protests were quite volatile too. In the middle came this entire thing about, the admissions crisis and a scandal in several universities about how admissions were happening. Then came this entire thing about whether Asians were being discriminated against or not. On top of all of this, there are obviously, the idea that how much funding do certain universities get and what is the source? We have seen many lists of late of the kind of money certain universities have received from China, even from Pakistan, from the Gulf states and so on and so forth. There does seem to be a whole range of things that are impacting the climate at the moment. And I wonder if you would take a moment and reflect on these and their, short-term and indeed long-term impact, such as they are.
Yeah, so I think, the American Academy or, institutions of higher learning in the US has gone through a number of different shall we say, moments of crises. What I'm particularly struck by is that this current cycle of crisis is, so much deeper than the earlier cycles. And I'll just give you one example, right? Because all of them, struck the institutions, to their core, some of them more deeply than others. But let me just compare the current moment to another crisis that, affected largely the major universities across the country, which tend to be more liberal or left-leaning than not. And that crisis was the election of Donald Trump. And what I'm struck by is there were protests and there were, people marching after Donald Trump got voted into office, but it didn't come anywhere close to what we are seeing here, right? And so I found that kind of interesting, which is, people in my institution after the election in 2016, people were literally weeping in the corridors. But they didn't go out and take over an academic building. And I'm sure that moment played out in other university campuses as well, where the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States was a traumatic moment for students, faculty, and other people on campuses. And whether that's justified or not, I'm just putting that aside. I'm simply saying that that was the reality. But people, did not do what they're doing right now. So I really feel that this current moment, the way people have responded has been significantly greater despite the fact that the election of Donald Trump is a far more significant event in people's lives because it has much deeper consequences on not only the lives of people, the lives of students, but also the larger state of the American society and economy and the global order. Because, frankly, I think the man is unhinged. He's a dangerous individual. He was dangerous then, perhaps even more dangerous now. And I just find it surprising that there wasn't more of an outburst at his election. Of course, one reason for that could be that, what can the university do? There is not much by way of leverage. And what would students be asking for if they were to go out and march in protest? And here, at least the students are looking for, divestment, or they're looking for some kind of a statement from university administration, or maybe just to raise their voices so that they put political pressure on the Biden administration to do something about, finding a resolution to the current situation. So perhaps they feel that there is a little bit more leverage today than the election of Donald Trump. I think some of the other protests, such as, the ones that followed, went along with the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, they were present on campuses, but again, nothing that approached what we are seeing right now.
The other question that many people asked in Chakraborty is that the student protests were one part of it. There were also a whole bunch of cases where there seemed to be many outsiders from outside academia, people who were not students, people who were not part of these campuses, who sort of in a sort of strangely seamless way seemed to have come together and fuel these protests. And in some cases, at least, there seem to have been, if not encouragement, acquiescence from certain professors. This is a volatile mix. How did this come to be?
No, I don't think that should be a surprise, right? I mean, university campuses tend to be open spaces. Unlike a lot of colleges in Oxford or Cambridge, American university campuses, you can walk right in, with some exceptions. Campuses like the main campus of Columbia is gated, so you can actually lock people out. That said, most other places, and Harvard Yard is gated and so on, but most other places you can kind of walk right in. So, you can't really stop people from outside who are unaffiliated with the university coming in. But ultimately, I think these are issues that are happening on the periphery that tend to take on a larger significance, either because people use them, to as garnish for whatever arguments they're making. You can't get away from the fact that there is a genuine concern among students, among faculty, among people in the university communities about what's happening in the Middle East. And whether that's being, potentially coordinated by people on the outside. And frankly, I don't believe it's being coordinated by people on the outside. They're certainly involved, no question about it. We've seen plenty of evidence that there are people on the outside who have either trained students or been part of protest groups. But ultimately, the bulk of this is happening with the active participation of folks within the university community. And so my main point is that these garnish elements, we should not allow them to steal the narrative. The main part of the narrative is that over 120 plus universities in the United States, just the United States alone, and this is just happening in other parts of the world as well, but in the United States, 120 plus universities, we're seeing protests, and ultimately, people are concerned about what is going on, and they are looking for a resolution. And you can't escape that fact. And leaders, whether they're university leaders or political leaders or community leaders, need to pay attention.
Talk to us a little bit about the future of foreign students. A lot of students I know in India, a lot of people have asked me, I went to Columbia, and a lot of people who sort of wish to go to Columbia or to Oxford and so on and so forth. They asked me these questions in the last few weeks, and I know many people, in the sort of communities where people have studied in Ivy Leagues or Oxbridge colleges, a lot of questions have come. asking about the real situation. Should some of these colleges really be applied to anymore? How safe would people be? All of those questions, even if they're safe, what if their degrees are impacted? Many of them take student loans to go there. All of these questions have come up. How worried are you and other academics like you that this may have an impact on international student inflow?
Yeah, I am concerned about, the impact it would have on international students inflow, but I suspect that that's going to be a bit of a short-term issue. Over the longer haul, as I said, I'm much more sanguine about the American higher education system sort of not necessarily snapping back, but coming to a new equilibrium. And largely because I do still believe that the American system of higher education is still, probably the best in the world. And in many aspects, and for many young people, it's still a destination. So, and these issues they remain front and center in our minds because it's happening right now. But we'll move on to a new state. I also believe that if you are a student or a prospective student and you're considering American universities, this should actually make you feel inspired. Because there is actually a voice on university campuses of people who are concerned about the state of the world. I mean, forget about which side you're on. The fact that people are actually kind of saying, "Hey, I care about something that is beyond my smartphone screen. I care about something that's beyond my final exams," should make you feel, boy, I really want to go to this place, and even if I don't want to be a part of the community, I respect a community that, cares about the state of the world more broadly. So, frankly, I would encourage people to see these as positive signs that the American academy isn't entirely dead.
Finally, I want to ask you, to going back to the second part of your argument about the wider impact on American society. Many people ask today, come November, if Donald Trump is re-elected to power to become president for the second time, will all of this, with already volatile situation, come to a new explosive point at that juncture? We don't know what will happen to the war in Gaza by then. We don't know what is going to happen to the war in Ukraine by then. And with Donald Trump coming back to power, do you foresee a new kind of maybe hard to control explosion at that juncture? How do you see that? How do you see such a scenario pan out?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of I've tried to stay away from making peering into the crystal ball, because I've tended to be wrong more often than I've been right. So I always look stupid, when the same video appears 6 months or 9 months later. But that said, my expectation is that we're not necessarily going to see an explosion on university campuses per se, because just like back in 2016 when Trump was elected, we didn't see an explosion on university campuses along the lines of what we're seeing now. And ultimately, people may be upset about the election or re-election of Donald Trump, but what's the university supposed to do? So I'm not sure we are going to see that. And I also feel that for many young people, they are in two minds, because Joe Biden isn't particularly popular either. So a lot of people might have regrets if Donald Trump is reelected, and the regret could be that why didn't I go out and vote? Because a lot of young people are actually planning not to vote. So I really think the focus on what's happening on campus is understandable because it's in the news. But ultimately, that's not the real news. The real news is the devastation that's happening in Gaza right now. The real news is that there's still hostages being held by Hamas. The real news is that we have a political election, a political cycle right now in the United States that could have huge consequences if Donald Trump returns. And those consequences are going to be a permanent open wound, on not just the political and economic psyche of the United States, but of the entire world, because that man is completely misfit. I mean, it's not a question of taking political sides. One could be a Democrat or a Republican, that's perfectly okay if you have reasonable candidates on both sides. I really feel this is a dangerous person to be brought back to the White House. And I really believe that is the news story that everybody should be focusing on and talking about. And whether we are talking about campus protests or not, the campus protests should be linked to what the implications might be for the way people go out and vote in November.
Bhaskar Chakraborty, thank you very much. As always, extremely astute comments and insightful comments. Thank you. It's been a tough few weeks for you and your fellow academics in America. I'm glad to see that you're holding strong. Thank you very much for your comments and throwing light on the situation with me. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Indal. Good to be back.